Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today we're looking at Order of Battle Pacific, the new turn-based war game, strategy game, what have you, by the Art Aristocrats. I know I mispronounced that in several of my videos previously. It's not the Aristocrats, it's the Art Aristocrats. I guess I just made some poor assumptions, and I may not have called that out earlier, so if I didn't, I'm sorry. But anyway, I am here in the middle of the battle for the island of Java. The assault on Batavia has been successful. We've taken the city of Batavia, and now we need to advance to the east side of the map and take the Krulak airfield, as well as destroying 10 enemy trucks in order to win our victory here. We've run into some stiff resistance in the south with much stronger defensive lines than I suspected, and we've had much more difficulty in the south owing largely to the fact that we don't have naval artillery in range. We're finally starting to break through the enemy lines. There is still a bunker in the south we haven't dealt with, and we've lost some pretty substantial casualties, but nonetheless we are pursuing the enemy, driving on, and attempting to be successful here. So we'll see what happens. Hopefully we win this battle and are able to continue on. I believe if you lose this particular scenario, you actually lose the war. So one of the drawbacks of a lot of games like this, like Panzer Corps or Order of Battle Pacific, I believe as well, is that for the early war scenarios, when you're playing as the Allies, you can lose and the campaign can theoretically continue because the Allies are supposed to lose. So if you lose, you might lose more severely than was historically the case, but you don't lose. That happens if you get to the late war scenarios. The early war scenarios, on the other hand, are the exact opposite. If as the Japanese or as the Axis, as the Germans, if you lose, you end up losing the entire war, because the games don't really play, well, what would happen if the Germans failed to take Poland, or what would happen if, you know, the Japanese don't take the Philippines. Well, the answer to that is they lose the war, at least according to the way these games work. You know, who knows what would happen in reality. I think it's probably a realistic assessment to say that if Japan failed to take the Philippines, then it would have been a much shorter war, a very different war as well, but it wouldn't have ended instantly either. With that being said, generally these kind of games at least make a plausible explanation of why maybe the war is lost, but you're not, you know, not necessarily the war is over, but you're removed from command. The infamous your services are no longer required quote from the original Panzer General game, where you basically are relieved from command because you fail, sometimes with some kind of explanation of what's going on, you know, like, oh, well, we failed to take Poland and therefore the German, or, you know, the Allies are already at the doorstep of Berlin, and you hear some bombing going on in the background, and then you're relieved from command. Something along those lines. At least makes it kind of a more plausible removal, as well as impact on why you don't get to see the war out. But I don't know exactly how Order of Battle Pacific handles it. Hopefully we don't deal with that, because I'd rather not have to show you guys the same exact battle twice. I guess we'll find out if that ends up happening, what I decide to do. Anyway, as you can see here, we've started to slowly break out here in the south. There's a lot of darn rivers on the island of Java. It's really a little bit frustrating to try and advance across all these different rivers, especially with enemy resistance to our front. But hey, you know, that's always one of the major obstacles in war is you know, trying to deal with the rivers that are in the wrong places, at least, you know, the not so convenient places. So, but that's where we're at right now. The Dutch are doing a good job in the north of delaying us thus far, and I anticipate that to continue. They seem to have a troop essentially located at every single river crossing just beyond the bridge, which makes it that much more difficult to advance. We can slow ourselves down by advancing upriver the bridge and kind of come around the enemy flank, or we can launch a suicidal frontal attack against an enemy force that's dug in with good supplies. So we're going to avoid doing the latter. You can see here the Dutch in the north especially attacking that bridgehead of ours. The AI in this game is very aggressive, I will give it that. That's an interesting trait, I think, especially for an AI that's dealing with the kind of challenges that the AI is dealing with in this game. The fact that, you know, they're heavily outnumbered, outgunned, outsupplied in every way. Their backs are against the wall, and yet the AI is never missing a chance to try and outflank, surround, or cut your troops off. You can see there the AI just cut that troop of ours off by swinging out behind its line and cutting it off from supply, and now it's got to go ahead and try and deal with being without a supply, which I think is it's a nice feature. You know, the fact that the AI is always looking to cut your supply lines is really one of the aspects that turns this game from a puzzle game into I wouldn't say a super serious war game, but it's definitely a more serious look at it. I didn't mean to, I know someone commented in one of the earlier videos that I took too big of a dig at Panzer General. Don't get me wrong, I love that game, and I talked about that in a previous video, how I really grew up to a large degree gaming on Panzer General. I'm not trying to say that it's not a thought-provoking and challenging game, just rather that it feels, when you play it, more like a puzzle, like a game where really you have the certain way to do something, certain exact way to do something. There's a correct way to do it, a correct force balance, a strict timetable that you have to meet, and it's almost like you're playing against the clock more than you're actually playing against any enemy kind of forces. This game doesn't feel as much like that to me, and I think part of not feeling that way is the aspect of supply lines and the fact that the enemy is always looking to cut you off from your line of supply. That adds more of a military feel to it. That doesn't mean it's less of a puzzle in the sense that, you know, there's certainly a certain force balance, which is ideal. Obviously, timetables are very important. I'm not discrediting that. In those ways, it is still similar to Panzer General. The way it's different is it doesn't feel as contrite as Panzer General sometimes does. You know, often Panzer General does not feel like a military simulation because it's so puzzle-oriented that you're just essentially, it just doesn't seem like a war game. It just seems like, okay, it's kind of like a dice rolling game where you've got to mix this unit with that unit and then you get X result, and mix that unit with this unit and X result, and there's no tactic or anything along those lines. Whereas the inclusion of supply lines, the ability to be cut off from your supply line, doesn't in of itself make Pacific General a superior game, but it does feel more authentic. Again, I love Panzer General, don't get me wrong, and I don't mean to harp on this topic, this discussion point, because I'm not going to come back to it, but really that was my only point, is just that the fact that can happen, the fact that you do have that addition of supply lines and supplies in this game in a much more real feeling way than in Panzer General, gives this game, in my book, an edge. And that's really all I had to say about it now that I've rambled about it for, like 6 minutes now. So we'll end that there. You can see here we're still trying to break out toward the east side of the map. We're only about 11 turns into the game. We're making pretty good progress, but these units along these bridgeheads are certainly slowing us down, frustratingly so. We're slowly wearing them down, but they're inflicting more casualties on us than I would like. And there you have it there, another enemy force in front of a bridgehead, preventing our advance to the east. So we're getting strung out, and we're starting to lose some casualties that are going to need to be replaced as well. Meanwhile, in the north, it's more the terrain that's slowing us down as we advance along these roadways. And again, cannot forget the need to destroy these trucks, which surprisingly are pretty darn resilient to naval gunfire. You'd think they'd be sitting ducks, but they seem to be a little bit tougher than I would like. Maybe just because I'm not good enough to destroy them really, really quick. Recently, I think my last, or maybe 2 videos ago, I mentioned that I'm currently reading Silent Victory by Clay Blair, which is an absolute classic of a book about the U.S. submarine war against Japan. According to everything I've read about it, it's still considered widely to be the best history of the U.S. submarine warfare against Japan. I was a little disappointed to see it's not on Kindle or anything like that. I do a fair amount of my reading on Kindle, but I do prefer books, paperback or hardcover or what have you, physical copies of books that I really like. Well, that might be unfair. I do prefer physical copies of books that I really, really, really love and want to be able to come back to time and time again. So I, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll buy the digital copy, and if it's a book I really enjoy, I'll buy the physical copy. But anyway, I had started reading that book back in college, so over 5 years ago, and had gotten about halfway through it and misplaced it in a class, and then it got stolen, and I lost it, and it wasn't the easiest book to come across, and it's a book from the 70s, but still is available on Amazon, but I didn't really have the time to go back to it to purchase it or anything. Anyway, my wife recently purchased it for me last year for my birthday, and decided to go back to it, so I'm just getting back into that. I'm starting over, though, because 5 years is a long time. I had been about halfway through it. I was through about 1943, so going back to that. But one other book I wanted to talk about is another book that I'm reading. Actually, this book I'm listening to technically on Audible, which is not something I'd really ever done before. I never really got into the whole audiobook, I wouldn't call it craze, but I just never really thought to try audiobooks for one reason or another. And figured, there was a 30-day free trial or something along those lines, and you get one free book. So I figured, hey, I'll do that. And I was looking through the different books and saw A Bright Shining Lie on there, which is more about Vietnam and it is about Vietnam. Although there is some World War II stuff in there. It would be certainly more applicable for a game on or for a video on Vietnam 65. So I'm not really talking about the book in too much detail. It's a Pulitzer Prize winning book, basically a biography of John Paul Vann, who was a very talented U.S. military official. I guess that's what you'd call his role, even when he wasn't in the Army anymore, who fought in Vietnam. And the book follows his time there from 1962 all the way to 1972. Spoiler alert, when he dies. Sorry, that's mentioned in literally the first page of the book, so it's not really spoiling anything. But anyway, I've been reading that book, and for the purpose of this video, or not reading, I guess, listening to, for the purpose of this video, however, the reason I bring it up, again, not really talking about Vietnam so much, but the book also has some character profiles of some of the key figures in the Vietnam War. And many of those, as you would guess, were actually military officers during the Second World War in the U.S. military. That's where they gained a lot of their experience and their history. And the book does a good job of not just talking about Vann, it also gives a lot of pretty detailed, full chapter-long explanations of who some of these people were, where they came from, what their role was. And the reason I'm bringing that up is I wanted to talk about the landing craft in World War II. And the reason I'm bringing that up from the Japanese side is I think it's an interesting fact that very few people know, unless, you've specifically sought out information on the Higgins boat, which is the primary U.S. landing craft during World War II. You see it in Saving Private Ryan on the Normandy beaches, although technically I don't think that's a Higgins boat, because I think the ones they show in the movie are actually made of steel, and a Higgins boat was made of wood, but otherwise it was the same. The Higgins boat was the primary U.S. landing craft in World War II. It was not by any means the only one. They had armored track landing craft. I forget the names of them. And then they had some ducks. There were a bunch of different types of landing craft. But while you don't see them as much perhaps in footage of the Pacific campaign, because the Marines definitely used some tracked vehicles as well, the Higgins boat was the most popular and most widely used landing craft throughout World War II. Why am I bringing that up right now, and why am I talking about A Bright Shining Lie? Well, the reason I'm bringing it up is because of the fact that the boat was actually inspired largely by the Japanese in their early war campaigns. And I thought that was really interesting. It wasn't something I had ever really heard or ever really knew. But actually in 1937, I believe, Victor Krulak, and the reason I mentioned A Bright Shining Lie is Victor Krulak was a Marine lieutenant general during Vietnam, and probably would have been the commandant of the Marine Corps if he hadn't ended up, after a while, becoming opposed to the war and scheming against Westmoreland, and the book goes into great detail about that. But what the book also talks about is Victor Krulak's essentially invention of the Higgins boat. He was a brilliant man, had certainly some flaws, and fell in line with a lot of U.S. military figures early in the Vietnam War, where they were supporting the war, very unwisely in the way it was being fought at the very least. Whether you agree or not with the war, what the U.S. was trying to do there, one thing is hard to disagree with, and that's the fact that the war was fought very miserably and ineffectively. And Victor Krulak was a Marine general, but he cut his teeth in 1937 when he was stationed in China with the U.S. military. Well, if we talk, I don't think we've really talked too much about China yet in any of these videos, but in 1937, the Japanese were launching a campaign to conquer China, piece by piece. So, they started in, was it 33 or somewhere around there, 36, when they invaded Manchuria and were going after the resources there. Well, in 1937, the Japanese attacked Shanghai. And they were, obviously it was an amphibious attack against the port city of Shanghai. And as the Japanese were coming ashore, they needed landing craft to bring their troops ashore. Well, Victor Krulak was stationed in Japan as a member of the U.S., I don't really know what the force was designated, but essentially the U.S. military command, which was in China, just kind of as an observer more than anything. And at the time, the Japanese actually honored the U.S. officials there. Whenever they would kind of come around on their boats and whatnot, they would render them honors because the U.S. and Japan were at peace. So Krulak actually kind of sailed out into the middle of some of these naval operations that the Japanese were launching against the Chinese, and kind of went back and forth in like a little boat, essentially, just kind of observing the combat as it was going on, and ended up using a telephoto lens to take pictures of the Japanese landing craft. And the Japanese landing craft were very different than the U.S. landing craft. Almost every U.S. landing craft up to that point had actually required soldiers to dismount either out the back or have to kind of go over the side of something. So like a heavy kind of embankment on one side of the craft, the soldiers would have to climb out and often land in the water before they could then, move ashore. And that was very inefficient, especially for bringing supplies ashore. Well, Krulak noticed that the Japanese landing craft actually had a flat bow. It was just kind of a flat bow with a small little ramp that would drop down, and then the soldiers would just walk off, largely dry, or at the very least in very shallow water, and just kind of move off onto the beach without too much inconvenience, very little time. Certainly you'd be exposed as you come down that ramp, but it allowed the landing craft to empty itself incredibly quickly when compared to the other landing craft. And units would come ashore much more organized than when, three guys go off the right, one guy goes off the left, someone goes off the front or off the side. It was a much less disorganized experience. So he recorded these, took pictures of these landing craft, and sent the photos to the Navy in the 1930s. His superiors were very impressed by his work. He recommended that the U.S. military adopt a landing craft along similar lines, and well, nothing came of it. When he came back to the U.S. a year or two later, he kind of looked into it to see what had come of his report, what had come of his recommendation, and found out, well, not much. Nothing had come of it. The Navy bureaucracy, in its efficient manner, had filed it away as some nut recommendation from some guy in China. And he didn't leave it there, however. He actually ended up continuing to pursue the objective. He built a mock-up of the Japanese landing craft, and then ended up sharing that landing craft with Higgins, who was... That is Andrew Higgins, who was involved in the lumber industry for some time and was also a boat builder and a barge designer based in the South. I believe New Orleans it was. So when Krulak essentially built his scale model essentially and started sharing that information with Higgins, and the Marines eventually ended up pursuing a new military transport, Higgins was ideally placed, and Krulak had provided the impetus. But in the end, it all came back to a Japanese invention, a Japanese landing craft, which largely inspired it. Obviously, there were substantial differences between the U.S. military's version and the Japanese Navy's version, but the idea of a bow ramp that would fold down and let troops just run off, that came from the Japanese and had a significant impact on the way the Second World War was fought. It would have been interesting to see what the U.S. would have come up with as a landing craft if they had not already had the Higgins boat, because it was so effective. So anyway, yeah, I just figured I'd share that short little story with you. I thought it's an interesting example of a situation where bureaucracy ends up kind of hindering progress initially, but then one very determined individual makes sure it still happens and makes sure that whatever they need to do to get it done, happens. And it's a great example all around of, again, the determination of one person being able to make a substantial difference in the conflict, while at the same time also, the weaknesses that could have otherwise prevented that particular project from getting off the ground. And it's also interesting to think, what would the naval campaign have looked like if they hadn't had the Higgins boat. They did have other landing craft, like we talked about. They had a tracked landing craft, but again, for the most part, those required troops to go over the side. One of the tracked landing craft, I can't remember what it was called, but I got to ride in one. I've never been one who's been into reenacting all that much, but I have a friend who's into reenacting quite a bit, World War I most specifically, but another friend of a friend is really into World War II and kind of has a whole bunch of gear, so I got to go do that once in Michigan, and we landed off of U.S. Navy Reserve landing ship tank, or not landing ship tanks, LCAVs, the metal and bigger version of the Higgins boat, essentially, that the Navy built in the 60s and 70s and still uses today. Anyway, we landed off of some Army Reserve landing craft like that off of Lake Michigan to Benton Harbor, Michigan. But also at that event, there was a couple of World War II Marine landing craft as well, and they were kind of these tracked vehicles that had a ramp in the rear as opposed to the front. I don't remember where I was going with that. But yeah, there were other landing craft that were available, but I do think that the Higgins craft being made out of wood, being as cheap as it was, certainly that had to have played an impact. And I don't think, especially for the campaigns in Europe, were very predominantly Higgins boat specific. But what I'm really getting at is it's hard to imagine the military, although I would say it's certainly possible given the dramatic infusion of American industrial power during this time, during World War II. It's hard to imagine as many of those landing ship tanks and other vehicles being built as was necessary by all the different amphibious landings. There were thousands and thousands of Higgins boats that were built, and they were cheap and they were quick. They were made of wood. They were really easy to manufacture, and they were cheap. That was, I'd say, the biggest aspect, is the fact that they were cheap to make. Which was not the case of the tank versions that had tracks, and they were nice for the Pacific, especially for the coral reefs, because they could crawl up over coral, which was definitely necessary, especially in some of the later landings. That's one thing that the Higgins boat wouldn't be able to do, is it wouldn't be able to crawl over coral if it hit a coral reef. So while the Higgins boat was great and was heavily used in Europe because there weren't coral reefs, some of the landings in the Pacific were not very suited to the Higgins boat. But the point, again, that I'm getting at is it's hard to imagine enough landing craft being made that were basically tanks. The U.S. military did make 40,000 tanks, but imagine if they had to make 10,000 more tanks because the Higgins boat wasn't available. That would have been a huge expense, and it certainly would have affected production of other items. So I do think that the Higgins boat played a very important role, and it's interesting to me that it came largely from the inspiration, anyway, of a Japanese landing craft during the attacks on China, and an enterprising young, I think he was a lieutenant at the time, Victor Krulak. But yeah, I just thought I'd share that rather interesting story about the development of the Higgins boat and kind of Victor Krulak's role in that. And again, I got that from A Bright Shining Lie, which is a book about John Paul Van in Vietnam. It's an interesting book. As you can tell, that story has literally nothing to do with the Vietnam War, other than it's kind of a brief part of Victor Krulak's history, his life, his experience, and he was involved in the Vietnam War in a rather important capacity, especially as far as John Paul Van was concerned. So that's why I mentioned it, is because it's a book, again, that provides some really insightful and really well-done character portraits of figures who had important roles in previous conflicts as well. It does a good job of talking about a lot of them. Another fun World War II fact that I also learned from A Bright Shining Lie is that Krulak was actually, well, I already mentioned he was a Marine, but in World War II, he actually was landing some of his men behind Japanese lines. I believe it was on the island of Bougainville in the Solomon Islands, and his men ended up taking some casualties and getting evacuated out. It was a kind of a covert raid behind enemy lines that they were doing in preparation for the eventual landing of troops on the island later on, and they took some casualties and needed to be evacuated out. Krulak was wounded, and they were pulled out by some PT boats. One of them commanded by a young naval officer named John F. Kennedy. Krulak actually was thanking Kennedy and told him that he had a bottle of, I don't remember the type of whiskey, back in his barracks, and if they lived through this, he would share a glass with Kennedy, essentially. It was some really high-end whiskey at the time. And he wasn't able to because of circumstances. They didn't end up meeting up when he got back to his whiskey, so they never ended up sharing that. But when John F. Kennedy ended up becoming president, and Krulak was a major general, I believe, at the time, he ended up sending a letter to the president. I don't remember if he sent the actual scotch with it, saying that this was, what he owed him a drink, or if he just suggested that they end up having the drink. I think he sent the actual scotch to the president and said, or whiskey to the president and said, here's the drink that I owe you, or whatever. And Kennedy apparently loved it and ended up inviting Krulak to the White House, and was one of Krulak's very firm supporters in his career. Ended up getting him was influential in getting him his third star, although he was certainly qualified for it. And that's I guess another interesting story that, again, I got from this book, A Bright Shining Lie, which is more about Vietnam, but again has some interesting character portraits. Krulak, as I mentioned, would end up becoming a lieutenant general. Never got his fourth star, largely because of his opposition to the war. He was not always opposed to the war. That's one thing that a lot of people who study Krulak fail to understand, is that initially, in the first years of the war, he was very, very strongly in favor of it. Krulak also had some serious role to play in the reorganization of the Marine Corps, in getting the Marine Corps to essentially survive. Played a significant role in the conflict in Korea. Many attribute him to being a pioneer of using helicopters to transfer Marines around the battlefield, and all around an innovator and a very brilliant man, although a man who, while brilliant, had, if you look at his early Vietnam War experiences, seriously maybe blinded himself to the realities of the way the conflict was going, and the qualities of the ARVN in particular. So I thought that was interesting, but not to go off too much of a tangent here. That's, I guess, your interesting historical tidbits from today. I'm going to try and keep these videos a little bit shorter than they've been running lately, so I'll probably cut this one off shortly after 30 minutes. We're at about 29 now, so we'll play for a few more minutes. But as you can see here, we're making some progress here in the south. Again, we've driven back a couple of different enemy blocking points, and we're now dealing with a pretty substantial one of over 4 units or so. You can see it had another truck unit, actually 2 truck units there. We destroyed one of them. We've got another one in our sight. And I will say I'm not a huge fan of needing to chase trucks around. It actually makes this scenario pretty difficult because we're getting pretty close to the objective, but we still need like 5 more trucks destroyed. And I don't know where we're going to find them all unless we just start racing around the map and hoping to find them. But my lack of air power is also hurting. We just lost one of our dive bombers to enemy aircraft, or enemy anti-aircraft fire. And things are not looking up right now while we are advancing, and we only are about halfway through this particular scenario. The Dutch and Americans and Australians and British are certainly providing a headache of a experience for us to try and advance on a timeline. The geography is also much more difficult than I had anticipated. These are not rolling plains with big wide open fields to advance across. These are forested, relatively rough, difficult terrain with lots of rivers, which are just really a pain in the ass, to be perfectly honest. Progress is slow when you have to cross a bridge that has an enemy unit every 3 frickin' hexes. But you can see here we also got some reinforcements which were dispatched to us. We've got 3 transports with some troops up to the north. Having the perk that we got the other day is going to be very useful as well. If you recall, when we had to choose between specializations, we chose the Tokyo Express specialization, and what that does is it allows destroyers and cruisers to provide supplies to landing beaches. So when we land these troops here, if we land them behind enemy lines, or if we land them in an area where there are no cities or supply points here on the map, they would be instantly out of supply within 1 turn. They'd all have that red little circle and lose a substantial amount of their combat effectiveness. However, because we have the Tokyo Express specialization, all we need to do is position some destroyers adjacent to the hexes that are controlled by us, within those little red front lines. And if they're adjacent to that, those destroyers can provide supply to the ground troops and prevent them from going out of supply and maintain their effectiveness in combat. So that's a neat little feature that the Tokyo Express specialization offers. It represents the fact that during the Guadalcanal campaign, Japanese destroyers and cruisers often provided substantial amounts of supply to the land forces on Guadalcanal and were instrumental in allowing the Japanese to resist there as long as they did. Also, one destroyer doesn't necessarily provide enough supply for an infinite number of units. Units do require a certain amount of supply, so essentially you have the option of running totally out of supply, which is represented by a red circle next to your hit point strength. If you're kind of in like half supply, then you get a yellow circle where your combat effectiveness is reduced, but not as dramatically as if you're totally out of supply. And then obviously there's the option where you have no little circle there, like all of our units right now, or you're completely in supply and you don't have to worry about any reduction in effectiveness. But anyway, that Tokyo Express option should come in handy here as we're landing our troops. It does look like we've got a pretty good amount of infantry, or not that far away from our troops, so it's certainly possible that the Tokyo Express isn't going to be critical in this landing, but it is a nice feature to have here, especially as we move on. I assume we'll have a few more amphibious assaults before we are strictly on the defensive against the Americans, or at least that's my hope. Maybe we'll even take Australia and take the war to the US. I'm not sure. I guess we'll find out. But anyway, you can see here our naval ships are moving up, providing gunfire support now that they destroyed what was left of the Dutch fleet. And we continue our advance to the east side of the map. We're getting very close to the far east side of the map in that last objective city. Still have several more truck transports that we need to find and destroy, but we are making progress. With that being said, I think we're going to go ahead and look at wrapping this video up here within the next 2 minutes or so. You can see on the northern end, again, we are advancing. The Dutch continue to provide some annoyance and resistance where there is a river. There are Dutch troops dug in behind, and they're certainly delaying and slowing us up. The Dutch tanks and APCs are annoyingly strong and very effective, and have been delaying us quite substantially and frustrating me quite a bit, especially in the areas where we don't have gunfire support. They just are... they're very difficult to deal with for whatever reason. I guess the Dutch must have had really good APCs and tanks or whatever. You can see there the Dutch aircraft are kind of roaming the skies at will. We've pulled our dive bombers back largely. We lost one unit, pulled the other back, and are pulling our recon planes back as well to try and save them. You know, I don't like having to rebuild units from scratch because then you lose all of their experience that they gain. And as we get into war with the Americans, who are certainly going to have a technological superiority over us, I think it's going to be absolutely critical that we maintain our edge in, at the very least, experience for those initial scenarios as the Americans become more involved and the British become more involved in situations where they're not heavily outnumbered and outgunned. But anyway, guys, that's going to about do it for this one. We're at about 35 minutes. So we'll go ahead and cut this video off here mid-turn or mid-battle or what have you, and we'll pick it up on the next one. I do appreciate you tuning in. I hope you enjoyed that little talk about Victor Krulak and his history. Fun fact, while he was denied the command of the Marine Corps, his son would end up getting it in a very, very successful military family with a lieutenant general and a general in the family. But anyway, guys, I appreciate you tuning in. If you enjoyed this, please let me know in the comments. If you didn't, let me know that as well. And until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.